The ANC support has continued to come under pressure in the last couple of elections, following last year's local government elections in particular. Lots of research coming out suggesting that the country could potentially see a national coalition government after the 2024 polls. This, of course, coming in the midst of what will also be the implementation of an electoral amendment bill that we're anticipating to be passed through Parliament before the 2024 elections. For more on the story, we're joined by political analyst Tessa Dooms and elections analyst Michael Clark. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. There seems to be so much up in the air in terms of the road to the 2024 national elections. I think I first want to talk about what the type of elections that we're likely going to be in for will look like before I get to the conversation of coalition governments. Of course, by and large, it seems that it's going to be a very bumpy road given the kind of timeframes we're looking at for the finalization of the electoral amendment bill. Tessa?
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, we are on a speed train towards December 10th when Parliament is meant to finalize the bill. We are looking at, in the short term, the 16th of September, this coming Friday, as another deadline for the public to be able to give comments on the bill. But the committee, the Home Affairs Committee, has limited it to what they call substantive changes that they've made to the bill since its last iteration, rather than continuing to keep it an open process around the entirety of the bill. And there is a lot of contestation still on many parts of that bill that the Home Affairs Committee seems to not have taken cognizance of in previous submission rounds. And we're not getting anywhere with really asking the Home Affairs Committee to explain its rationale around the things that it's accepted about the bill that are still contentious. But in the run-up to the 10th of December, we also then have an NCOP round where the bill will go to the NCOP. And they should be opening it up for submissions as well. And we hope, at least in that round, that we have an opportunity to open up this debate and have a much richer debate around some of the implications of the ways in which they would like to implement the Concord's judgment. And I think there's a question about whether we are coming up with a bill here that is not just about the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law that gives everybody who contests in the 2024 elections a fair opportunity to contest, but more importantly gives voters the opportunity to vote in ways that their votes all matter and all count, and that there is ability to do accountability after the vote. And I think we will have these two opportunities, and I hope that the public really insists that this Home Affairs Committee takes seriously the kinds of debates and conversations that have been raised in this process.
Michael, when we look at the criticism, particularly for this interim report that has been adopted by the Home Affairs Committee, as Tessa has described, we often hear the phrase fatally flawed and questions of constitutionality coming up, bearing in mind the fact that between December 2022 up to 2024, there's effectively less than 2 years that we're looking at for any questions around what kind of election we need to run to not only be resolved, but have the logistics and the machinery around that election be put in place.
You're correct. And I would go so far as to say we are actually already in a crisis. You know, when we talk about constitutional faults, that sounds like an academic term. In reality, there are several fundamental areas where the bill is unfair either to independent candidates or to smaller parties or to the voters themselves. And the unfairness of the system in the bill lands up being unconstitutional because we have to have fair elections and we have a constitutional requirement of equality before the law. And there are some major areas where independent candidates, for example, in the National Assembly, independent candidates require between 70 and 90,000 votes per seat, whereas political parties require around 44,000 votes per seat. That is a fundamental unfairness but it is also unconstitutional. So I think there's a need to ground the detailed and technical discussions into practical consequences that affect voters and the candidates.
At which point, Michael, when looking at this journey, and I hear you say we're already in a crisis, do we reach then that point of a crisis that impedes the running of the 2024 elections? And, we've heard the likes of One Movement with Mmusi Maimane and others saying that perhaps what we need to be having a conversation about is some form of consensus agreement on what the 2024 election must look like, following which then the true reform of the country's voting system can take place.
This may prove more difficult to accomplish than many people would realize. The substantive submissions of a number of organizations, and particularly this new round of submissions, is going to say that there are still fundamental areas and fundamental faults, as you described, with the bill. There is a very high probability that there will be a constitutional challenge to the bill after it is passed, if it stays in the same form, or indeed the president, after the NCOP has passed the bill, the president may end up referring that bill to the Constitutional Court himself. If that happens, there is a very strong case to be made that the Constitutional Court will find key provisions of the bill to be unconstitutional. Now, in talking about a consensus view, the only problem with that line of thinking, and it's understandable, but the only problem with that approach is nobody may negotiate with the court. Different parties, different interested bodies and persons will put their case to the court, but nobody can do a deal with the court. The court will decide. And if there is indeed this crisis, it is unconstitutional, we know already, to hold an election without allowing independent candidates. But on the other hand, the method chosen by the minister and parliament, if that is also found to be unconstitutional, you have this contradiction. And certainly the different parties will propose ways and perhaps compromises and measures to reach an accommodation. These will be proposed to the court. But nobody can say to the court, this is how you will rule. We had a timing conflict last year with the local government elections. And in several respects, I think the court gave a ruling which proved to be effective in the end, but which many people didn't expect. And so we can't presume to know how the court will be ruled. Certainly many people will work towards possible compromises and proposals, but we can't know how that contradiction would be resolved in the end.
Tessa, one of the issues that was raised by the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and I think it's really key in as far as looking at this reform more holistically, centers around the ability of citizens to be able to understand the electoral system that the country is operating under. So if we talk about the freeness and the fairness of an election, it can only be truly free and fair if the people who are expected to participate in the election actually fully understand what it is that they're doing. With all of these complexities that have arisen and potentially the limited time to educate the public about these changes, are you concerned about what the implications of that will be?
Yes, certainly. I think we must not underplay this process. And I think what's happened in the last 2 years is we have not heard enough about this. We've not spoken enough about this. And the process that Parliament went through in terms of their own going out and doing public participation has been near farcical. Part of Parliament's job in this as representatives of the public was to do that level of awareness, was to do that level of engagement that is beyond just saying, well, here's a bill, read it. I've read this bill several times, and there are parts of this bill, particularly around some of the mathematical equationing and quota systems, which Michael, I think, will be able to explain better than I can, that I'm struggling with. How do we know that when those public participation processes happen, that parliamentarians actually took the time to talk through the complexities of this bill and what it is that they're proposing? But more importantly, what the effect is of this. What is the effect of this bill on our most fundamental right to vote for the people who will represent us, and more importantly, to hold them accountable afterwards? That's the big question on the table. And I think the view that's been growing out of a process that we've been convened around with organizations like Rivonia Circle, My Vote Counts, Defend Our Democracy, CASAC, and many other organizations, over 100 organizations who have now started discussing this substantively. We've really come to the point where we say that haste is going to be a problem in this process. It's going to make waste. Because if we just rush through this and we say, okay, let's just, compromise on this for now, we are substantively changing a fundamental right that South Africans have to vote without thinking about the long-term implications. And it would be not only a waste of our resources, our time, and our power as a country, our power of our state, but it will, if we end up in a situation where in a year or 2 years or just after the election, as Michael says, we find that the court says this is unconstitutional. We find that we have to be part of this process again. We will not only have done ourselves a disservice in terms of time, but a disservice in terms of particularly, giving ourselves the short end of the stick at a very crucial moment in our democracy, which is the 2024 election that could be absolutely game-changing.
So, Tessa, even with a proviso, right, that says we will run this election this way for 2024, and I'm speaking now in the context of whatever it is that Parliament adopts in December, do you think that even with that proviso, it would not be enough to effectively stay off whatever potential challenges there may be to this bill?
If the bill doesn't meet constitutional muster, which is what the argument is right now in terms of its ability to allow people to participate fairly, then, any deal that we're making is an unconstitutional deal, and is a deal that means when we go to the polls, we're doing something that does not meet our democracy standards. I don't think that's the kind of compromise we want to reach. If we could agree that particularly if this goes for a constitutional court challenge, which I'm almost certain that it will if it stays in this format. If the constitutional court says these things are unconstitutional, but we find a way to find a minimum amount of things that are not unconstitutional, and we reform that, great. But we are going to run into a time challenge. The IEC was at the Electoral endeavor that we hosted a few weeks ago, and they pointed out the timelines where August 2024, by the constitutional standard, is the latest we would be able to have this election. If we miss the December mark, we're really looking at a max around March to change this. And I really don't want us to be rushed by a parliament that has been lazy about this very fundamental exercise. Parliament was given this judgment handed down in 2020. It did not do its job until the minister had put together the Ministerial Advisory Council. It had not started to do its job. And so now we're being rushed by parliamentarians who had failed at their job into agreeing to something that diminishes our rights. I think we must push back against this and make sure that whatever we agree to before 2024 or thereafter is not only about it being, in the legal letter of the law correct, but something that we really believe moves our democracy forward in ways that are useful to us as the voters and the citizens, and not just because we're trying to do a checkbox exercise.
All right. Michael, anything you want to add briefly?
I think that the Parliament, when they got this judgment in 2020, in August of 2020, they had a detailed timeline worked out, including a system based on constituencies which would meet constitutional muster, and they had a very detailed timeline that ran through till about this time last year. And after that meeting in August 2020, when they knew that they had to commence work literally the next month, Nothing further was done until that Ministerial Advisory Committee was appointed. So that initial delay is actually the cause of where we are in this trap now, and there is no easy outcome for this process. In the long term, we have to have a proper system grounded in constituencies that come down to communities and that balance proportional representation in a fair way. That's going to happen in the end. And with all the delays, whatever the problems are, we need to start on the best system as soon as we can, even if we can't implement that for the 2024 election.
Michael, Tessa, let me thank you both for your insights tonight.